Hello, my name is Jonathan Ng. I'm with the Center for Presidential History, and I'm at Cornell University's Tech Campus on October 29, 2023. My colleague, Zach Kahn, is also here working the camera. Today we have the privilege to talk with Andrew Rotter about the life and the legacy of Walter LaFeber. Thank you for joining us. To kick things off, could you talk about your first encounters with LaFeber, either his reputation or meeting him in person?
I'd not heard of Walter LaFeber. I was a senior in high school. No, I was a junior in high school, and a close friend of mine, a fellow member of the debate team and someone I respected enormously, had gone to Cornell, and he came over to my parents' house to see me during his Christmas break. And he was pitching Cornell to me. I was still deciding about college. I didn't really know what I was doing. But he said, you really would like Cornell. It's a great place. He was in Telluride House, which was a kind of exclusive place for academically gifted kids. So he had a particular experience that I wasn't to have, but he didn't really emphasize that. But he said, there are some people you should take. If you come to Cornell, there's some professors who are really very good. And he mentioned Walt LaFeber. He said, this guy teaches a history of American foreign relations, and he's just brilliant. He knows a lot. His analysis will be, I think, congenial to you. He knew me fairly well politically. And so keep in touch, and if you decide to go to Cornell, Walt LaFeber is someone you should definitely take. So what followed was a decision, after all, to go to Cornell. And I went in the fall of 1971. And at that point, it was, now this is all done online and well in advance. I maybe had my first year seminar, but none of the other courses. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe psychology. I think a lot of high school students who don't know what psychology is think that psychology sounds cool, and that was me. But I was shopping for courses, and I did find a psychology course, and I had my seminar, and there was one other course. And then I thought, well, I should definitely take some history, and I remembered that Walter LaFeber had been mentioned to me by my friend. And so I went down in the basement of a famous Cornell building on the Arts Quad called Goldsmith Hall, where they had a kind of live sign up, and each department had a representative, and in this case the representative was the department chair, a man named L. Pierce Williams. And I went up to him, and I didn't know him at all, and I said, hi, I'm a freshman, and I'd like a history course, and I would like to take a course with Walter LaFeber. And he laughed, and he said, well, yeah, and he joined the crowd, but Professor LaFeber's courses are for people who are sophomores or higher. You're a freshman, and so you need to start with a basic Western Civ course, so we'll sign you into that. And I said, okay. And I ended up taking a Western Civ. I took the first half of Western Civ in the first semester and the second half in the second semester. And they were okay courses. They weren't great courses, but they were good enough that I thought, well, I like this history thing. Psychology didn't work out very well. And so I took Walter LaFeber's first half of his lecture course in my sophomore fall. So that would have been the fall of 1972.
Could you talk about those classroom experiences? What stuck out to you about LaFeber's teaching?
Yeah, I imagine this is going to be something you've heard a lot, and others will hear a lot too. First of all was just the enormous kind of analytical power of what he was talking about. That this was the time of the Vietnam War, and although in retrospect we could say that the war was waning, that the troops were starting to come home, it wasn't evident to us at the time that this is the way it was going to go. And I was 18 years old, and this was a real issue for me, not just in kind of intellectual terms, but in personal terms. And so the first thing I think I looked for was someone to make sense of current foreign policy dilemmas. Well, the first lecture was on, I think, John Winthrop and the Puritans in the 17th century. And I thought, well, this isn't going to quite get there. But almost immediately he did get there by talking about the city on the hill and America's aspirations and the subsequent tragedy of American diplomacy that went in a very different direction. And I could see right away after that first lecture where this was going. And that was the kind of analysis that I was really craving. So that was a good part of it. But the other part was, and again, I think everyone will have told you this, the remarkable performance of it. I would come to know only in later years that Walt really liked going to the theater. He loved opera, and he and I and his wife and my wife would talk about operas that we'd seen. We lived in within an hour and a half of each other. We often went to the same operas and talked about them a lot. It was a remarkable performance. As I say, other people have talked about this. I'm sure I've written about it. But you'd be sitting in this auditorium, and there'd be a sense of like you were at a rock concert, and you were waiting for the band to come on. And then the band would come on, and it was him, just him, in a jacket and a tie, or maybe a raincoat if it was raining. And he would carry a briefcase, and I'm sure the briefcase had something in it. I mean, I know it had his lunch in it, but maybe something else. And he'd come in, and he'd just set the briefcase down. It was a prop. And then he'd take off his outer coat if he had one, not say a word. His TAs would be there in the front, sort of, wrangling people and making sure everyone was settled. And if there were any questions, they would answer it. But Walt was on the stage by himself. And he would turn to the board with a piece of chalk, and he would write an outline on the board. That's all he would do. And he was a tall man. He had big hands that he used to gesture. But it was all very minimal. It was all very quiet. And he would either start pacing, put his hand in his pocket, and he would pace, or he would sit down at a table. There was a table strategically placed on the stage, and his TAs, I know, were responsible for making sure the table was there, and I think clean and in the right spot so everyone could see him and he could sit more or less comfortably at the table. And he would sit on the table, or as I say, he would pace. And he always wore a suit or a jacket and tie. So he had this kind of conservative button-down look. And then at precisely 11:20 on a Tuesday or Thursday or Saturday morning, he would start talking. And he wouldn't wave his arms and say, okay, time to be quiet. And he wouldn't raise his voice even. He just talked. He just started talking. And immediately a room full of a couple of hundred people would go silent. It was better than a rock concert. I mean, at a rock concert, you still got people buzzing and talking and milling around. Everyone just sat there listening quietly to this man speaking in a normal conversational tone of voice about U.S. foreign relations, about stuff we'd never heard of or thought about or cared about John Quincy Adams or William Seward or, the Whigs and westward expansion. And it all seemed so matter of fact. It came from somewhere deep in that soul of his or that brain of his. And we were all just rapt. This could come up in another way, but I suppose I'll say now because I'm thinking about it. People talk about saving their notes from LaFeber's class, and those of us who became academics, but also those who didn't. Everybody exchanges stories about how the notebooks are still there and still moldering, and I saved my notebooks, of course. But as I look back on them, I got the gist of what he was saying in my notes, but I was kind of disappointed in myself. I hadn't gotten as comprehensive a bunch of notes as I was kind of hoping that I had. And I realized, looking back on it, that I was so caught up in, again, the performance of it, the presentation of it, listening to it, that sometimes I forgot to write. And it's a bit of a challenge at exam time. Again, I kind of realized this only retrospectively. Notes are not really very good. Does anyone else have better notes? Well, other people did have better notes. But I had notes enough to be able to structure my own lecture courses in future years. But I didn't have a whole lot of content, a whole lot of grist in my notes. And I think it was because I was just so bowled over by what I was hearing and how it was coming out, how it was coming at me. That's a confession.
Well, it's great that you have those vivid memories. Were there teaching strategies that LaFeber used that you decided to take into your own career?
Yeah. So it was an amazing thing, and so amazing that I couldn't imagine ever doing it myself. So my story is that I went on and majored in history, but I also thought that I might want to be a teacher. It didn't occur to me that I would teach college, largely because I couldn't do that. He was the only person who could do that. And I had other very good professors, but they were nothing like LaFeber, but they were all enough and knowledgeable enough and articulate enough that I couldn't imagine myself being one of them. So I thought, well, like high school teaching, that's it. I mean, it's hard in its own way, but it's different. You don't have to be quite such an expert. You don't have to stand in front of the room and just kind of talk off the top of your head the way he did, noteless for 50 minutes at a time. You give them a little assignment during class, and there's either they write a paper or you show them a few clips of something. Films, we had slides then. I thought, well, I can do that for 50 minutes in front of a group of 16-year-olds. That's not as hard as doing what LaFeber does. So Cornell didn't have much of an education department, but it did have an affiliation with Ithaca College, a college across town. And you could take for Cornell credit, I think, 2 Ithaca College education courses. So I did, and in doing that, they also arranged for me student teaching. So I student taught at Ithaca High School, Western Civilization, for a semester, or most of a semester. My teacher was really good about kind of leaving things to me. He let me watch for a week, and then he said, okay, your turn. It was mostly, I remember, about Napoleon. It feels like every night I was going home and thinking, okay, what else can I say tomorrow about Napoleon? And one of the kids in the class was Scott LaFeber. This is kind of an aside, but it's a small town. And Walt LaFeber's son, Scott, was one of the students in my class. So I was sort of conscious that he might be coming home and telling his father how he was doing. Nevertheless, it was a good experience. It was a lot of work, exhausting. Yet at the end of it, I think I taught for maybe, 6 weeks or 7 weeks or something like that, and then it was done. I thought, well, okay, this is good. I like teaching Napoleon to 16-year-olds. So I went to see Walt, who was my advisor, one of my advisors. And I said this to him. I said, I kind of like this, and I think I could do this for a living. And he smiled at me and he said, yeah, teaching high school is a really important thing, and it's a really good thing to do, but it's not for you. You want to get a PhD and teach college. And I was absolutely flabbergasted that he believed somehow that I could do that. And by this time I'd taken 3 classes with him. So he knew me pretty well. I still thought of myself as kind of a fraud and someone who had a lot of interests, one of which was history. And I especially thought of myself as someone who just could never do what that guy did. And therefore, this was an impossibility. But here he was telling me that it wasn't an impossibility, that he thought I could do it. And I was so gratified by that and so honored by that at that point, I couldn't let him down. If he thought I could do it, then I guess I'd better do it. So I said, well, okay, how? How does one go about doing this thing? And he said, well, you go to graduate school and you get a PhD in history. And here are the programs I think you ought to think about. And, I'll write a letter, and Professor Joel Silby will write you a letter. And I had one other person, I can't remember who it was, another historian, I think, who wrote a 3rd letter for me. But he said, well, let's see what happens. So he gave me a list of 5 or 6 places that I should apply, and I kind of nodded dumbly at him and walked out. And I went home, and I remember sitting down with my housemates. We always had dinner together. We were kind of an unusual group of 8 men living off campus, and we had dinner together 5 nights a week. And pairs would be responsible for cooking for the nights, and then every 4 weeks you had the 5th night, which was international night. So I think it was maybe international night, a Friday night, which usually meant like canned Chinese food. And I said, so Walt LaFeber says I should go get a PhD and become a history professor. And they all sort of laughed indulgently and said, gee, that's nice. I think they were almost as shocked as I was because they knew who I was. But then I went ahead and I applied to a bunch of places. And the first response I got back was from Harvard, and it was no. And I was just so depressed. I thought, oh, this isn't going to work at all. And then I got the yeses. And it was because of him. There's no question. He wrote me a letter I didn't deserve. I'm absolutely certain of that. And he got me into a bunch of places. And I went to Stanford, which was kind of ironic because he'd started at Stanford and left after a year. And he sent me off to work with someone with whom I was not all that compatible, a bright man but a difficult man. But Walt thought it would make me a better historian, and he was right. So that's what I did. I think I've wandered away from your question, but I take it that's okay.
That's phenomenal. Are there, could you talk more about his relationship to you as an advisor? Were there things he said that continue to inform the way you think about the world, the way you relate to students during your postgraduate studies?
Yeah. Well, he was a wonderful advisor. I'm sure other people have said this too. We keep hearing the stories downstairs about going and waiting in line outside his office, and you had to wait in line. He had a lot of students. A lot of people really wanted his time, and he was going to give everybody his time. That was okay, because often those hallway conversations were pretty enlightening. For the first couple of years, I felt like the most inconsequential person in that hallway. And that wasn't anything that Walt LaFeber did. It was just about the intellectual candle power of the other people waiting, including graduate students. And you would just wait your turn and go in there. And he just seemed to have all the time in the world. He clearly didn't, He's a very busy man, but he just seemed so relaxed, willing to listen. I tried not to impose on him too much, but he was the gentlest and most supportive kind of advisor I could imagine having. And so this raises the question, you raised the question of his example to me as an advisor, and I'll just expand that to talk about teaching. I've said that I didn't think I could possibly be the kind of teacher he was, not certainly in this lecture room where he was such a brilliant performer. But I did try. I think I hung on to the lecture format long after most of my colleagues had decided that lecturing really wasn't the way to go, either because they weren't comfortable with it or because they detected that the students weren't really getting it. There are studies that show that the attention of a typical 19-year-old boy, forgive me if this comes close to home for you, but it was about 15 minutes, and so you couldn't give a 50 minute. You just couldn't do that anymore. I was stubborn about it, and I was stubborn in part because I'd seen Walt LaFeber do it to a whole room full of 19-year-old boys and others. And although I knew I couldn't do what he did, I thought if I worked at it, if I really prepared myself, if I thought it through carefully, if I rehearsed the lecture, I could do something similar. And that's what I did. So he became a model for me. I was an inadequate student, as all of us were with him, but at least I could try to do something simulating the Walt LaFeber experience. The other thing I should say has to do with discussions, because it wasn't all lecture. LaFeber used to have TAs, of course, and he would have these discussion sections scheduled. And his policy was you could go or not. He was going to give 3 lectures a week, and if you wanted to go to discussion, it made a lot of sense because then you could talk about the reading, and if you had questions you could ask, and you could get a little more wisdom from the TA or from Walt himself, and at least get a kind of leg up on the course material and maybe do better on exams. So I would go, but every week he would lead one of the sections, and I would always only go to his section, which was, fair enough. The TAs were great, I have dear friends and colleagues who were TAs for Walt LaFeber, not my TAs, but they were TAs, and they would have been really great. I would have learned a lot from them, but it wasn't like being with him, and I think they'd be the first people to say that. And what I remember about that, again, that kind of informality, the formal informality, so the tie and the jacket, but then sitting on a desk and eating his lunch frequently, because the section would often be right after class. So it'd be about 12:30, and he was hungry. It was time to eat lunch. So he'd pull out a sandwich, and he'd eat his sandwich. And he was very polite about eating the sandwich. It wasn't like, I don't care about you, I'm blowing you off, I have to have lunch. It was, forgive me, I have no more time in my day, I've got to have a sandwich now. I promise to swallow before I answer. So he'd just sit up on the desk, and a bunch of us would be there. And he'd, kind of unpack his lunch, and he'd look at us, and he'd say, so what's on your minds? What do you want to talk about? Now that breaks every pedagogical rule anyone has ever taught or learned. You should never do that. And it worked, of course, it worked every time, because people wanted to hear more from him and wanted to ask him stuff. And so it would take a little while, but eventually people would get up to speed and ask him questions, and then he would answer the questions. And sometimes he'd answer in a couple of sentences, and sometimes he'd spend 5 minutes at the board saying, oh, that's interesting. Let's talk about various kinds of investments that countries make in other countries. Whoa, I had no idea what this was about, but it's kind of stuff like that. He'd really just go deeper on stuff. And he'd go wherever the questions took him. And again, it was, in its way, as impressive as the lecture, because he didn't know what was coming. He just knew it. He just knew how to answer questions. And every now and then he'd say, gee, I don't know, what do you think? That I asked you. But I thought, okay, that can't possibly work. But as I grew in maturity as a teacher, and depending on the course material, I often started a discussion that way. And I taught a course for many years at Colgate on the Vietnam War. And most of the time, the kids who were in that course were highly motivated, really interested in the course material. And I learned to say at the beginning of discussions for that class, so what's on your minds? What do you want to talk about today? And it mostly worked. In fact, it almost always worked. This is an aside, but it's sort of an okay aside, I think. I had a younger colleague who had joined the faculty at Colgate, and he was struggling a bit, especially with discussions in his class. And so he asked me if he could come to one of my classes and just see, how a discussion might go. And I said, sure. And it was the Vietnam War class. So I walked into class. We worked out a day when we were going to be talking for the whole 50 minutes, I think, instead of lecturing, and sometimes I'd show film, and he didn't need to know about that, but he wanted to see how I led discussion. And so I came in, and I introduced him to my class, and I explained, he's here to see how discussions go in history class. And I said, so what's on your minds? And they just took off. And for 50 minutes, it was back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And it was always okay in that class. It was always pretty good. But this was the best it had ever been. They were obviously performing for him, and on my behalf, I think. In fairness, they liked me well enough that they wanted to make me look good. So I said 4 words during the entire discussion, 50 minutes. At the end of 50 minutes, one of the students, better student, looks over at my colleague and says, "So, how'd you feel about that?" And I felt kind of bad, and he looked shocked, and I said, "It's this class. They're a really good class, and they love this material. So it's not about me. Don't ever try to do that." And I talked to him about some strategies for getting discussion going in classes where discussion didn't go so well, and I had plenty of those too. But that LaFeber model kind of invited me to the same kind of standard. I would say in my case it was arrogance to imagine I could meet the standard, but nevertheless, this was the standard, the model he set, and I tried to simulate it.
Well, it's amazing to see how his legacy lived on through your teaching career, and clearly the example that he imparted has and continues to sort of reap fruit. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the relationships you had with him after you graduated. You mentioned that you lived fairly close by and
Yes.
that you'd go to social events and had some shared interests.
Yeah. It took me a very long time to consider myself an adult in his presence. And this was all on me. It was nothing to do with him. He wasn't intimidating, except insofar as he was just so brilliant and so good at what he did. And I think it's often hard, I find this with my own students, even though I'm no Walt LaFeber, for former undergraduates to even address you by your first name. And even if I invite it, as I do with my former undergrads, I always say, please call me Andy by my first name, not as their undergraduates. No, I'm much more formal about that. But once they've graduated, they've crossed that line. But it was tough for me to imagine myself as adult enough, accomplished enough to, just call him up, even though we lived very close together. So when I started graduate school, I went pretty much straight from undergrad to graduate school, and I wouldn't recommend that to anyone. I did graduate early, so I had an extra, 6 months off or something, but still, I was much too young to go, and I shouldn't have gone. I should have waited a year or two. I should have worked. I should have traveled. I should have worked on language. So it worked out, but at the time it was rough, and I wrote him a couple of times that first year. And I remember the first time writing him in a very kind of discouraged way, saying, I'm not sure this is for me. I'm not sure I can do this. I was on my own. I was lonely. I had a small graduate class, and everyone in it was settled in some way. Everyone was in a relationship or married, and I wasn't. So I felt very socially isolated, and I felt kind of intellectually out of my depth. And I wrote to him, and he just wrote back very calmly and said, you can do it. At one point I said, could I come back and work with you? And he said, we've discussed this, and the answer is no. We've given you all we can give you. You'll be fine there. You just need to kind of get used to it, figure out how to be a graduate student and a historian. And he was right. I mean, it took till that first spring, my first year of graduate school, but then I sort of got it. The penny dropped, and not that I was ever brilliant at it, or enjoyed it very much, frankly, but I figured out how to read and write like a historian, more or less. But after that, I bounced around. I had a job for 4 years at a college in California, and then I came to Colgate just for a year and thinking it would just be a year, and went to Vanderbilt, and that was a tenure track job, and I thought that's where I would stay. As it turned out, it wasn't. I was there for a year, and my wife is an academic too. We needed 2 academic jobs. She was finishing her dissertation. She was pregnant. It was the 1980s. Vanderbilt didn't believe in hiring pregnant women, and so they didn't offer a job. But Colgate, which was surprisingly more enlightened perhaps, offered us both jobs. They were very eager to have my wife, and they were right to be eager to have her. So we went back to Colgate. I'm sorry, that's a lot of obiter you don't need. But so the late 80s, and I thought, I'm back at Colgate. I'm an hour and a half away from Walt LaFeber. And yet it took me a while, to consider myself peer enough or even adult enough to initiate any kind of relationship. And he called me out. I went to a celebration for him at a Schaefer meeting. It was a lunch, and I'd been invited. His former students were there. The room was full. And he went around the room, and he said something nice about everybody in the room. He remembered everything. And he came to me and he said, Andy Rodder, he's starting a good career as a historian, but he lives like an hour and a half away, and he never comes to see me. And I was so embarrassed. I thought, he wants me to come see him. So I went home, and I told my wife, and I said, we got to go see him. You haven't even met him yet. And she said, of course. And so I finally kind of broke through because he embarrassed me. And I began, I got in touch with him, and he said, of course. He was so gracious. And so we began to see him once, twice, 3 times a year. We'd go to Ithaca. We met a couple of times, I think, at the opera in Cooperstown, Glimmerglass Opera. We went out for dinner. He and his wife, Sandy, with my wife and me and our 2 daughters, who were then, I want to say, maybe 10 and now a little older, say 12 and 8, 12 and 9. So it's a little chaotic at dinner with these sullen girls. But he was very nice about them, and he always asked about them. And so we finally, we got to be peers and friends. He would always ask me about my work. He would send me funny emails, great emails. We'd write back and forth. It was really a delightful and important friendship.
Well, that's a really sweet story, and I imagine calling you out, and on the one hand, it's a little embarrassing, but it also shows that he really cared. He wanted to maintain the relationship, so that's really cool.
Yeah, that's right.
Awesome. Are there any final reflections or thoughts that you'd like to insert into the record?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the one other thing I would say, we haven't talked about scholarship much. So my first book was really just an elaboration of the honors thesis I wrote for Walt LaFeber, and something I was interested in and wanted to pursue in graduate school. I imagined graduate school as a place where I could go and take a lot of courses. I knew nothing. I thought I could take some English classes, and Stanford, what a cool place to learn English. And you can't do that. At least you couldn't. You were being professionalized as a historian, and it was all history all the time. And I was behind. I needed to learn history. So I did that. But anyway, I hung on to this honors thesis that I'd written for him that I wanted to turn into a dissertation. It was a study of early U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, the origins of the Vietnam War in the late 1940s and early 1950s. My advisor at Stanford wanted me to do something else. I politely declined. I stayed with this. And the book was written from out of the revisionist playbook. This the capital R revisionist, Walt LaFeber, a guy at Stanford. Barton Bernstein was also a Cold War foreign relations revisionist. It was political economy. That's what the dissertation was, and that became my first book. While the book was kind of in the publication process, I went to India with my wife for like 10 months. She was doing her dissertation research. She had a grant, and we'd just been married, and I took a year off, and I went with her. Experiencing a place like that before you've read much about it changes your way of thinking about it and your way of imagining how relations between the United States and that place might evolve. It was more like amateur anthropology, emphasis on the amateur, than doing history. It was not archival work. But I got really interested in U.S.-India relations from the perspective of someone who'd been to India before he thought about a particular research project. And so my perspective changed, and it affected my work. The next book I did was really about culture, broadly understood, and U.S.-India relations. And it was not out of the revisionist playbook. And it had nothing to do, or little to do, with political economy. And I took a lot of heat for that. Walt understood. I think he was a little put out. I think he had hoped that I would continue working. There's lots to do, and the kind of conceptual framework of Cold War revisionism. But it wasn't where I had decided to go. And he was remarkably decent about that and very interested, and blurbed the book. And it was just really, really wonderful to see how tolerant he was of my idiosyncrasies. And that's how it went. I mean, I stayed kind of in that vein for my other work, and he always asked, he was always interested, always supportive.
Yeah, he seems like he was a very flexible and also caring mentor to so many people.
Yeah, that's one of the lessons we're getting over the weekend, that you didn't have to agree with him. You had to be serious. You had to do your reading. You had to go to the archives. And I did. I mean, this book, I should say, this India book was not just about my feelings about India. It was also about having had those feelings and having had those kind of emotional and anthropological connections to the place. I then went to the archives and wrote the book from the perspective of a culturalist, but with the source base of a more traditional foreign relations historian or revisionist historian. So I think he appreciated that. He thought I was taking it seriously, even if my perspective had changed.
Well, Andrew Rotter, thank you so much for sitting for this interview. This is really helping us understand the enduring legacy of LaFeber, so thank you.
Thank you guys very much.